So I'm going to be talking about Measure 110, which is in a lot of ways adjacent to literally and figuratively Measure 109. So Measure 110 was passed with twin goals, which is one, to reduce the criminal penalties for possession of drugs and to increase access to supportive services for people who use drugs or who have a history of drug use. There are some services people had not historically been able to access, either because they were currently using or because they had a history of drug use. And as it was mentioned in my introduction, the majority of funding for Measure 110 comes from cannabis tax revenue. So it is funded by and for people who use drugs for the most part, which I absolutely love. Right? So Measure 110 was written to try to address the high rates of overdose and also treat substance use like a public health issue rather than a criminal issue. I'm probably preaching to the choir, but substance use disorder is defined as repeated use despite negative consequences, which means putting people in jail that have a substance use disorder will not stop them from using drugs. Cutting them off, punishing them in any way is not going to actually make them stop using. It's in the definition of a substance use disorder. So I'm really excited that we are shifting the way we deal with people who use drugs. And at the time Measure 110 was written, Oregon had the third highest rate of substance use disorder and was 50th in the US for access to treatment for substance use disorder. This is what we inherited when Measure 110 was passed. This is also what we are criticized for right now. So it's going to take a long time for us to shift these things. But that is the goal of Measure 110 is to shift those numbers. So the criminal penalties for possession of controlled substances were reduced from misdemeanors to Class E violations. And with misdemeanors, from my understanding, people can go to jail for that. I have not been involved in the criminal justice system just out of sheer luck. So I don't have like a lot of knowledge around that, but another thing about Class E violations is those are not things that would prevent a person from holding a professional license if they were to get a Class E violation. And these are the amounts of drugs that are considered for personal use that were decriminalized to a Class E violation. Anything more than that, the penalties are reduced, but they are still at minimum a misdemeanor if they are over that. So Measure 110 was written with a mechanism where people would get a ticket from law enforcement, and then they were expected to call a phone number, complete a screening, and then they could get their citation dropped. And there were no wrong answers to the questions in the screening, but that wasn't necessarily super clear. But there are no wrong answers. It's not actually an assessment to see if people have a substance use disorder. And part of the engagement around the citation was also supposed to connect folks to any other supportive services that they would need. So there have been a lot of challenges with the engagement, and one is that some law enforcement officers in certain counties, it happens a lot more than others, but they just stopped writing those low-level citations. They didn't even bother, which means if we just follow the mechanism that was written into Measure 110, we can't connect people to services. We can't actually get them the help that they need. And those that wrote citations did not always give out the information on how to connect to those services, how to get their citations dropped. That graphic is a palm card that law enforcement was supposed to give out with every Class E violation. And, there were some police departments that said they never got their shipment of cards. Somebody put them under a desk. They didn't know what they were. There was nothing on a ticket that would clue somebody in as to the process they are supposed to go through. So we've been working to address these engagement challenges as we're also implementing Measure 110, which has been a little bit of a challenge. So as far as some of the solutions, we have a statewide number. People can call, people can get their citations dropped, and I think I had it on a slide, but I didn't say it, but there's no limit to how many citations you can get dropped. There is a time limit you have to get your citation dropped, but you can keep getting ticketed all day. It's nothing like drug court. It's not like you have one shot, and if you don't call, then, that's it for you. People can keep getting cited and keep getting them dropped all day, every day, if that's how it goes. But what we kind of changed is that people don't need a citation to engage in services. They can walk in the door of a program that's funded through Measure 110 and ask for help and get whatever help they need. If that program doesn't offer it, they can be connected to another organization, but there's no wrong door to engage in services. People can self-refer, and there are also outreach workers in every county that are going out and doing outreach and trying to engage people and make sure they know that there are now services out there. Which means if law enforcement never writes another Class E violation, we can still help people. It doesn't matter. The other issue is law enforcement is giving people this card and saying, call this number and tell us about your drug use and what's going on in your life. And it wasn't very clear, like, are you telling the police what I'm telling you? Like, who am I calling? Who's going to be honest? And so, that's just kind of like another challenge that we've had. And we also intend to do some more publicity around that so folks get a better understanding of what the assessment is and that, it's there to help them and we don't tell law enforcement whatever they say. So Measure 110 requires, they were called addiction recovery centers or behavioral health resource networks, or BERNs for short. And as of right now, they are required in every county in Oregon. I believe Measure 110 was written to require a BERN in every CCO region, which is 2 or 3 counties, I think, in most parts of Oregon. And so we decided we wanted one in every single county, especially in more rural areas. We thought it was really important to make sure that services were accessible a lot closer. And so each BERN must offer triage 24/7, 365. This can be done over the phone, and this is still being built up. But just being able to determine if people have acute care needs. Also, they need to offer these behavioral health needs assessments. And then if people want, they can also get a substance use disorder screening, but that is optional. They don't have to do that. I do have lived experience of injection drug use, and one of my fears would be like, this person's gonna tell me that I have a drug problem if I tell them what's going on. And like, sometimes that's not what you wanna hear, even if you think it might be true. So I like that that screening is optional for people so that, we don't scare them away. Nope. Can I get the next slide? This was working. Okay. So BERNs must also offer individual intervention planning if people want it, intensive case management and connection to services. Also peer support by certified peers that specialize in substance use. And outreach to people who cannot reach the physical BERN or the buildings or organizations. So that way people aren't sitting inside a building saying, well, nobody's walking through the door. I guess nobody wants help, because that's not always the case. So as far as the BERN services, all of the services should be provided using a harm reduction philosophy. So meeting people where they're at, not requiring abstinence. There are exceptions if it is a sober living or maybe a detox facility. But for the most part, for these services, we thought it was really important to make sure that everybody could access them who wants them. We also are looking to prioritize those most affected by the war on drugs. And historically, people of color have been more affected by the war on drugs. They're arrested and jailed at much higher rates. And so we are looking at racial justice and trying to make sure that people of color are not left behind with Measure 110. And also making sure that programs are culturally and linguistically responsive and specific. That's a bit of a tongue twister. Okay. And so setting up services in this way can just ensure that people are going to be getting services from somebody who hopefully maybe looks like them, shares their culture, their background, their language. All services through Measure 110 are voluntary. Nothing is required. If people just want to get a ticket and they don't want any other services, that's fine too. And all services are free. So insurance can be charged, but any sort of housing, they cannot charge rent, any kind of treatment, they can't charge any out-of-pocket costs. So Measure 110 is really looking to provide the lowest barrier services possible. Okay, and so the Oversight and Accountability Council, that is what I'm one of the chairs on, and I decided to apply to be on the council because I love people who use drugs, and I don't think prohibition works. And not everybody on the council is on that same page, but that's okay. So the council was formed in February of 2021. There are 22 people, different service providers. We have a very diverse group, a lot of people of color, a lot of queer people, and every month we spend hours, working to try to keep Measure 110 implementation moving forward. But pretty much everybody on the council has other jobs, and we're working at least one other job, and we still make the time to come together and work on Measure 110. And so what's really different about Measure 110 is that the OAC holds the power. Oregon Health Authority does not hold the power and cannot make decisions about Measure 110. So it's up to this council of 22 people from all across the state, all different backgrounds, and we have to come to agreements on how Measure 110 will be implemented and who will be funded through Measure 110. And it is a way to decentralize power and to really try to build a new system rather than try to continue with a system of oppression that has not historically worked. And through Measure 110, being on the council, I get a lot of opportunities that I would not otherwise have. So a couple months ago, we got to meet the Canadian Minister of Mental Health and Addictions, and she had questions about how Measure 110 was working for us. I know they're looking in Canada to decriminalize, and so it was amazing to be able to talk with her and find out a little bit more about what's going on in Canada. And I'm grateful for this experience and opportunity, and I just again love that it's really the people are in charge of Measure 110. So I hope this isn't too confusing. So a couple months after Measure 110 went into effect, we wanted to have a small grant process, which we called Access to Care, and that was basically a way to keep the doors open for some of these services. There's been a workforce shortage in substance use treatment. We wanted to be able to essentially sort of just fill in an immediate gap for services while we were writing these rules and creating this grant process to create burns, because we had to create everything. And I hope I hope we never have to do that again. So the Access to Care grants were about $30 million, and it was again just a way to help people across the state continue to access services that were currently available. None of these organizations were guaranteed to be in the burns once we got that funding going, but more than 16,000 people accessed services through the Access to Care funding that we distributed. So for our burns, we received more than 330 applications from organizations across the state. And again, the Oversight and Accountability Council has the power to fully fund, partially fund, or deny applications. We created a formula to equitably distribute $270 million. That was the rest of the money that we had to give out for a 2-year period. And we used Medicaid population, the rates of homelessness, the rates of arrest, and the rates of overdose death to determine funding for each county. And this is a peek at some of the counties. So there are some counties that maybe didn't have a lot of Medicaid population or unhoused people, but they had a lot of overdose deaths. And so that would affect the funding that they would be able to receive through Measure 110. We really tried to look at a lot of different factors to make sure we were accurately addressing the needs. And this is a quick timeline of our application approval for 2022. The OAC had subcommittees that had to approve each application, and then each county was voted on by the entire council. And so that was quite a lengthy process that happened over time. And I'll show. So this is the approval progress as of August 31st, which is International Overdose Awareness Day. We funded every county in Oregon, all 36, and we have now approved those funds, and so those funds are getting out the door, and we now are able to start really building up these burns and increasing access to all of these services. So that's all that I have. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Blue. All right, it's Q&A time. But before we begin, it is a treat to share stage with you. Thank you for doing the work you're doing. Thinking back to 2019 when I was part of a little roundtable discussing what would become Measure 110, it felt like it was the potential to be the biggest sledgehammer against the horrendous racist war on drugs, now formally in its 51st year. Informally, well before that, and the work that you're doing is incredible, and it's inspirational.
Thank
you. And prohibition doesn't work, and this will, and this is.
Right.
All right, 20 questions. Let's see if we can get through them all. I'm just kidding. All right, I'm just going to go with the questions that have been ranked the highest, and we'll go from there. My county received $17 million for Measure 110 treatment funding. They are giving 100% to traditional treatments, which they said they consider to be failed, and none to psilocybin therapy or psilocybin services. How come?
So I don't believe we defined treatment in the same way as far as substance use disorder treatment. A lot of what we were looking at was low barrier treatment, which might be medication-assisted treatment, inpatient detox, and I know that what we had to fund had to be like, like you have to be certified by the state as a substance use disorder treatment provider, and I don't know what that process is. If somebody was offering psilocybin and they were certified as a substance use disorder treatment facility, I don't see why they couldn't apply for Measure 110 funds. And we did fund some non-traditional treatment centers, although like I am hoping that we fund more in the future. I know we funded equine therapy in one county. I know that a lot of what we funded is based on 12-step programs, and those don't work for everybody. So I'm hopeful that like down the line, we will be able to expand to a lot of different options for treatment, because to me, harm reduction is about like, this is the menu, these are your options, and you get to tell me what you think will work for you. You get to try whatever you want. And, with this first round, we're just building this up. And so I do recognize that in some counties, there were not a ton of choices for treatment.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm reminded that this is our first round, and just because that hasn't happened yet doesn't mean it's not going to happen. And like you said, we're getting the program off the line, and we don't have yet Oregon licensed practitioners to allocate to our service centers. So, great question. Hopefully coming soon. Does Measure 110 allow, I love this question, allow for sharing of small amounts of quote-unquote drugs, which some people may call them entheogens, medicines, such as providing 3 grams of psilocybin mushrooms to someone? They want to know if they can give people drugs.
You won't go to jail for giving people drugs. I think that's sort of what Measure 110 is about. So I think, gosh, what was it, under 12 grams maybe? I don't remember. But yeah, so if it's under that, it's not like saying you can give people drugs, but if you do give people drugs or you're holding drugs, you're not going to go to jail for that. And if you get a citation from law enforcement, you can get it dropped and get it taken off of your record. But I wouldn't go so far as to say that, because I think most of the other council members would probably not agree with me.
and you're also representing the government, perhaps, as well.
I mean, we're a group of citizens working with the government, but it's a weird gray area.
I got the answer I wanted from that.
Okay.
DMT was not included in the list of decriminalized substances. Was it a proactive reason for not inclusion or just an oversight?
Hard to say. So with the exception of, I believe, hydrocodone, all of the substances that were in my slide were written into Measure 110, and I had nothing to do with the actual writing of the ballot measure. There are other things like ketamine that wasn't in there, fentanyl, which very complicated, but I'm kind of glad it's not in there. But yeah, there are definitely some substances that were left out, and I'm not sure why, to be honest.
My read was that oversight, not in like any negative way, but it wasn't necessarily just considered. I mean, and if we were having the conversation we're having now, we may have been given special protection to peyote, sacrament and medicine of Native American folks, and they've asked it not to be included in decriminalization measures to protect their wildlands. And so the conversation's evolving. And so I think when people think about 109 and 110 and something's not included, it's almost never, from what I see, anything malicious or anything negative, and it wasn't considered because it's nuanced. All right, I'll try to keep my narrative to a minimum. All right, did professional, another one. For Measure 110, personal amount is 12 grams of actual psilocybin or 12 grams of dried fruit body?
No, I don't know.
I believe it's the weight of the mushrooms itself, and then the psilocybin is in the mushrooms. Is that right, everybody? Yep, get a thumbs up.
Okay.
Did professional medical licensing boards approve this? I think this means Measure 110. Does a Class E violation show up on a background check for employment or a medical licensing application? That's a tricky one.
It is tricky. So there was a paper that was written before Measure 110 was passed, and it looked at the impacts. It included racial justice, but it also did have a section which just said that the way that a lot of professional licensing works, a Class E violation should not prevent somebody, should not get somebody's license revoked, but I don't know any other specifics. I know it was talking about all different kinds of licensing, so teachers, cosmetologists, I don't know, but there are a lot of licenses people can get where if they were to traditionally get a misdemeanor, they could lose that license. And so I don't know if it shows up, but it did say that it was not supposed to affect whether or not somebody could get their license taken. I hope that's helpful.
Do we have data about who's getting citations? Is that public? Is it private?
I think it's public. So we have been getting data. There are some counties, Multnomah County, they don't seem to be ticketing people very much. In other counties, police seem to be ticketing every single person, thinking like this is going to be the solution, or at least we can still harass these people. I'm not sure. But I know there's data out there, and I don't know if it actually has things like race or not, but I know we do have numbers for each county that we usually receive once a month or once every other month. So it is out there somewhere.
Cool. And I got a sense that they're kind of asking them too about the privacy of individuals and just having some confidentiality. So maybe whoever asked that can chat with you more later. I love this question as well, are there plans to expand the limits and coverage of Measure 110 to further decriminalize possession of larger amounts and a wider range of plants, fungi, substances, molecules, gray matter.
Yeah, I don't think at this time there are any plans. Like I said, I know that not everyone on the council agrees with how I feel about decriminalization, but all of the other amounts were shifted. So some amounts that were felonies were reduced to misdemeanors. So even if somebody does have more drugs than what's considered personal use, those penalties have also been reduced. It just got really fuzzy, and I couldn't find a way to put it on a slide where it wasn't messy.
When you say not everybody agrees, is that because you believe in this approach and you're interested in even broader decriminalization or more support?
I mean,
Is
speaking as a citizen, yeah.
Okay,
Absolute. People need a safe supply. Our overdose rates, not just in Oregon, but across the country, just keep going up, and we need to do more to keep people alive.
Yes. On that note, similarly, I feel like it is dumb luck and privilege of who I am and my identity that I also have not gone to jail or prison as well, considering my background. I love that you shared that. And just a quick note, there are many groups working on decriminalization, more broad decriminalization. The one way that we've talked about it in a group that I'm part of, time's up, all right, one moment. Plant Medicine Healing Alliance, and there's many other groups like this, including local chapters of Decriminalized Nature. Some have changed their names to something else, but they're working on how I feel about it, and maybe you feel similar, is completing the policy picture that's emerging in Oregon, where you have a regulated, accessible model for psilocybin, and maybe in the future we add on additional entheogens as polling catches up and people support it and we get our legs under us, while also allowing the FDA process to continue, as well as broad-based decriminalization, because the plant should be fully liberated. We should not have to have government approval if people want to engage in ceremony or home cultivation. It's the way it's been, and again, prohibition is the abolition. And so there are many groups working on that. Plant Medicine Healing Alliance is just one. And next we have several people who are part of that effort. So it is underway, and maybe it'll constitute a ballot measure at some point. But people are working on it.
Thank you. And I think this is my water, right?